Okay, globalization. You've heard this word a million times, right? It's one of those huge buzzwords that gets thrown around to explain, well, pretty much everything about the world today. But what are we really talking about when we say it? Let's get past the buzzword and figure out what's actually going on.
All right, take a look at this picture. This is Khao Sun Road in Bangkok. I mean, you've got a Burger King right there, currency exchanges, signs in English, all mixed in with the Thai. It kind of feels like the perfect snapshot of globalization, doesn't it? Super busy, totally connected, a street that could almost be anywhere on the planet. But is that really what it's all about? Is globalization just this slow march towards the whole world looking like one giant American-style shopping mall? That's the big question we're going to dig into right now.
And that brings us to something that a lot of people call the flat world myth. It's a super common idea, it's pretty powerful, but you know what? It's also a really simplistic way to look at the world.
So the engine driving this flat world myth? It's a concept called cultural imperialism. And the theory is pretty straightforward. Basically that dominant cultures, like Western culture, just spread out like an unstoppable wave. They wash over everything, destroying local traditions and replacing them until, poof, the whole world starts to look and feel the same.
I mean, look at this. This is exactly what people are talking about. Those golden arches popping up in Cairo. It feels like such a clear story, right? One culture just replacing another. But when anthropologists started digging into this, they realized, hang on, the story is way more complicated than that. And that really kicks off a huge debate. When different cultures meet, is it always a battle? Is it always about one winning and the other losing? Or is something else happening? Something more creative, more complex? Could it be a story about hybridity? So here are the two big ideas, side by side. You've got cultural imperialism, which says we're all headed for a future of sameness, and then you have cultural hybridity, which says, no way! All this mixing is actually creating brand new, totally unique things.
Okay, so why did experts start pushing back in that whole imperialism idea? Well, it really boils down to three main critiques. First, it kind of treats people in non-Western countries like robots who just passively consume whatever's thrown at them. It completely denies their ability to choose or to innovate. Second, it pretends culture is just a one-way street from west to east. I mean, come on! Think about all the food, the music, the art that flows from the rest of the world into the West. And finally, it totally misses all the cultural exchange that happens between non-Western regions, like the huge popularity of Indian films in Nigeria. That has nothing to do with the West.
So if imperialism isn't the whole picture, what is? Well, this is where the idea of cultural hybridity comes in. And this is so much more than just borrowing. It's about actively taking something from another culture and then tweaking it, changing it, and making it your own to serve your own purposes.
And this quote right here, it just nails it. The key idea is that people are never just blindly adopting stuff. They are always adapting what they borrow to fit their own local needs. They're not just passive sponges soaking up Western culture. They're smart, selective creators.
Okay, check out this amazing real-world example. Back in the 80s, weavers in Otavalo, Ecuador started buying TVs. Now, you might think, here we go, they're becoming westernized. But no, that wasn't it at all. They put the TVs in their workshops to entertain the workers, which actually helped them boost production of their traditional textiles. Think about that. They took this foreign technology and used it to strengthen their own local culture. It's brilliant.
All right, so we've established that culture isn't just getting steamrolled. But what about politics? How is all this global connection changing our idea of countries and borders, the nation-state?
You know, the common wisdom is that globalization is making countries weaker, right? That all this free flow of money and people and ideas is making borders kind of meaningless. But just like we saw with culture, the reality is so much more interesting than that.
In fact, far from erasing national identity, globalization can sometimes make it even stronger, just in new and unexpected ways. And that brings us to this idea of long-distance nationalists. We're talking about migrants who, even though they live in a new country, stay deeply involved in the politics and struggles of their homeland. And this photo just captures that perfectly. Here you have a Dominican woman, she's in New York, and she's campaigning hard for an election that's taking place in the Dominican Republic. She's physically in one nation, but she's a political actor in another. Her national identity hasn't vanished at all, it's just stretched across the globe.
This really makes you stop and think about what citizenship even is. See, there's legal citizenship. That's the simple part, what your passport says. But then There's something called substantive citizenship, and that's all about the actions people take to be part of a country, to claim their membership. For people like this, their substantive citizenship, their actual involvement, stretches way beyond the lines on a map.
Okay, and this leads us into one of the trickiest, but also one of the most important questions of our time. As all these different cultures and beliefs mix and mingle more than ever before, what does that mean for the idea of universal human rights?
I mean, in a world with so many different cultures, whose definition of rights is the right one? Is there one set of rules that should apply to absolutely everyone everywhere? Or do we have to take local culture into account? It's a really thorny issue for sure.
So the debate usually gets boiled down to two opposing camps. On one side, you have the rights versus culture argument. It basically says universal human rights and local traditions are in conflict, and you have to pick a side. But then, on the other side, you have the right to culture argument. This view says that the ability to live out your own culture is itself a basic human right.
But anthropologists look at this and say, wait a minute, this whole either-or debate is based on a totally flawed idea of what culture is. They see culture not as some static, unchanging rulebook, but as something dynamic and always evolving. And a great example of this in action was an anti-violence program in Hawaii. Instead of just imposing outside ideas, it blended the language of universal rights with local Christian and indigenous Hawaiian traditions. And it worked. It was way more effective because it wasn't rights versus culture, it was rights working through culture. It shows you don't have to choose.
So, where does that leave us? If globalization isn't a giant steamroller crushing all diversity, and it's not some perfect melting pot either, then what on earth is it? Well, anthropologists say we just need a better way to picture it, a better metaphor.
It's not a steamroller, it's a process of friction. That's the big takeaway here. Globalization is not some smooth, easy glide into a single world culture.
So what is friction? Think of it as the messy, sticky, sometimes difficult, but often super creative stuff that happens when global forces bump up against local realities. It's that clash, that resistance, and it's right there, in those messy interactions, that all the new things are actually born. New ideas, new identities, you name it.
And that leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. If globalization isn't just making us all the same, if the goal isn't to turn Bangkok into Boston, then what is it making us become? What new kinds of people, what new kinds of societies are being created in all this friction? Now that's something to think about.